Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tracing the incredibly complex, really fascinating medical journey of upper GI tract malignancies. We're going to look at the whole picture, from the microscopic cellular origins of these diseases all the way through to the life-saving treatments deployed by modern medicine. If you've ever wondered how clinical pathways actually work in practice, from spotting a tiny cellular change to executing a major surgical intervention, well, you are absolutely in the right place. Let's jump in.
Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the origins and risk factors of esophageal and gastric cancers, look at the clinical signs, the diagnostic tools we use to confirm them, and finally, how we tackle them with targeted medical and surgical treatments.
All right, part one, origins and risk factors. Let's talk about where it all begins.
So, what actually transforms normal, healthy upper GI tissue into a malignancy? I mean, cancer doesn't just happen overnight, right? A normal cell becomes a malignant cell through a series of accumulated mutations. In the GI tract, this multi-step process usually kicks off with chronic inflammation or persistent environmental exposures. The cells are essentially forced to adapt to survive. But sometimes, that adaptation goes terribly wrong.
A perfect example of this is Barrett's esophagus. When a patient has chronic acid reflux, or GERD, the normal squamous lining of their lower esophagus is just constantly bathed in harsh stomach acid. To survive that incredibly toxic environment, the tissue actually physically transforms. It replaces its normal squamous epithelium with metaplastic columnar epithelium, which, interestingly, is a lot more like the lining of your intestines. It's a really clever survival mechanism, but it comes at a massive cost. It opens a door for dysplasia, which drastically increases the risk of progressing to adenocarcinoma. It's literally a biological defense mechanism turning into a critical risk factor.
Moving right along to part two, esophageal carcinoma. There is a really fascinating anatomic and pathological divide between the two main types of esophageal cancer. First, you have squamous cell carcinoma. This usually pops up in the proximal, or upper to middle parts of the esophagus. Its risk factors are heavily tied to lifestyle and specific conditions. Things like smoking, excessive alcohol intake, a swallowing disorder called oculatia, and even a rare genetic condition known as tylosis. Then you have adenocarcinoma, which is a completely different beast. This one occurs distally, right down near the junction with the stomach. And as we just talked about, its primary drivers are GERD and Barrett's esophagus, along with obesity. Recognizing this split is absolutely crucial for understanding patient profiles.
Next up, part three, gastric carcinoma. Let's look closely at the stomach.
Now, gastric carcinoma is heavily influenced by a wild mix of environmental, genetic, and bacterial factors. The absolute standout here is Helicobacter pylori. Amazingly, this bacteria evolved to survive the intense acid of our stomachs, and it is so damaging that it's officially recognized as a Class 1 carcinogen. Why? Because it causes chronic atrophic gastritis, which can eventually lead straight to cancer. But H. pylori rarely acts alone. Add in a diet high in nitrates and salt, which is super common in certain parts of the world, along with smoking, pernicious anemia, adenomatous polyps, and actually even having blood group A. You put those together and you've got a perfect storm for gastric malignancies.
Part 4. Recognizing the clinical signs. What are the warning indicators we need to watch for?
We constantly have to be on the lookout for what we call alarm factors. Upper GI symptoms can often be pretty vague, maybe a bit of indigestion or dyspepsia. But if you have a patient, especially someone over 45, presenting with new onset dyspepsia, combined with dysphagia, which is difficulty swallowing, or persistent vomiting or unexplained weight loss, that is an immediate red flag. It takes it from a textbook concept to a real-world emergency, demanding urgent investigation to rule out a malignancy. The harsh reality is that these cancers often present late. If the disease progresses under the radar, patients might show up with some pretty grave signs of advanced spread. We're talking about a palpable epigastric mass, or hepatomegaly, an enlarged liver. Jaundice and fluid buildup, called ascites, usually mean the liver or the peritoneum is involved. You might even see classic hallmark signs like Virchow's node, a hard, enlarged lymph node resting in the left supraclavicular fossa, which is also known as Troisier's sign. Or acanthosis nigricans, that darkening of the skin folds. Spotting these late-stage signs really underscores exactly why early recognition of those initial alarm factors is so incredibly vital.
Okay, part 5. Essential diagnostic investigations. How do we actually confirm the disease?
Let's walk through the diagnostic pathway.
The absolute gold standard first step is the endoscopy, or OGD. This is our direct window into the GI tract. It allows the physician to visually locate the lesion and take multiple biopsies, right from the edges of any ulcer. And remember, even malignant ulcers can look like they're healing if a patient is on acid-suppressing meds, so doing a biopsy is non-negotiable. Once cancer is confirmed, we use endoscopic ultrasound to see exactly how deep the tumor has invaded the organ wall. Finally, we zoom out. We use CT or MRI scans and occasionally a staging laparoscopy to check if the cancer is spread to distant lymph nodes or other organs.
All of those diagnostic tests feed directly into the TNM staging matrix. This is how we categorize the exact progression of the disease. T stands for tumor depth, ranging from in situ, meaning it's strictly confined to the surface, all the way up to T4, where it's actively invading adjacent bodily structures. N assesses whether it's hit the regional lymph nodes, and M tells us if there is distant metastasis. This isn't just administrative paperwork. This matrix literally dictates the patient's prognosis and tells us exactly which treatments they're eligible for.
And finally, Part 6, Targeted Management and Treatment. Let's get into the medical and surgical care.
Let's look at stomach surgery first. When we're talking about curative gastrectomies, the goal is straightforward. Remove the cancer and the surrounding lymph nodes so it doesn't come back. We typically compare localized D1 resections against much wider D2 resections. A D1 takes out the tumor and the immediately adjacent perigastric nodes. A D2 resection, on the other hand, is way more extensive. It clears out the lymph nodes all the way around the celiac axis. Because the blood vessels and anatomy there are so incredibly complex, D2 resections are highly specialized and usually performed in dedicated tertiary centers just to ensure safety.
Now, once the tumor is out, the GI tract has to be put back together. Surgeons have to choose their reconstruction method carefully. They might go with a direct Billroth-1 connection, which is a simpler reattachment right between the remaining stomach and the duodenum. Or they might need to do a more complex Billroth-2, also known as a pulley reconstruction. This essentially bypasses the duodenum entirely by sewing it shut into a stump and then attaching the stomach directly to the jejunum. The choice really just depends on the location and the extent of the tumor they had to remove.
Shifting gears over to esophageal cancer, honestly, the overall survival rates historically remain pretty tough, but our defensive strategies are highly structured. For early, localized disease, like stages T1 or T2, we attempt a radical curative oesophagectomy, but surgery alone usually isn't enough. Adding preoperative chemotherapy, typically a combo of cisplatin and 5-fluorouracil, actually improves survival odds compared to surgery alone. For patients who just aren't fit for a massive operation, chemoradiotherapy is the next best option. And critically, for advanced disease where a cure just isn't on the table, the focus shifts entirely to palliation. We use things like expandable stents and laser therapy to keep the esophagus open, ensuring the patient can still swallow and maintain their quality of life in those final stages.
We've mapped out a really intense clinical pathway today, going from those initial cellular mutations caused by reflux and H. pylori all the way to massive anatomical reconstructions. But I want to leave you with a provocative thought about where oncology is heading. As we move away from just blunt force surgery and general chemotherapy, targeted therapies, like using trastuzumab for tumors that overexpress the HER2 protein, are finally entering the fray for upper GI cancers. Might these cellular-level targeted interventions be the key to finally rewriting the prognosis for these devastating diseases? It's an absolutely fascinating frontier in medicine. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this gave you a clear, structured view into the clinical realities of upper GI neoplasms.